everyone. I'm Yusuke Yamada. I'm working at Daito Bunka University in Japan. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers behind the screen, and thank you so much for organizing such an exciting event. I'm studying contemporary Japanese environmental literature, especially Ishimure Michiko's works. And as you might have guessed from this title, Nature Narrative Repetition, in Ishimure Michiko's Lake of Heaven, today I'm going to explore how Ishimure Michiko thought and wrote about nature and narrative. So first, let me briefly introduce Lake of Heaven, one of her representative novels. Lake of Heaven, the original title, Tenko, is published in 1997. And Ten means sky or heaven, and Ko means lake in Japanese. And Bruce Allen translated this novel into English and published in 2008. In this presentation, I will use his translation. The story is about the imaginary mountain village, Amazoko village, submerged by a dam about 35 years ago. And there are many characters, but I will introduce main persons who I'm going to mention today. Masahiko, young man from Tokyo. He comes to the dam lake where the village sunk to scatter the ashes of his grandfather, who was born and raised in Amazoko village and passed away in Tokyo. As the story progresses, he gradually learns about the village while interacting with the former residents of sunken village. And at the beginning of this novel, he coincidentally meets with elderly woman Ohina. She is one of displaced villagers and knows a lot about village and their nature. And Kappei, middle-aged man, is also a former resident. He was only a child when the village was submerged. So let's briefly look at some of the previous studies. As you can see from these phrases, this novel contains many scenes depicting the relationship between nature and humans. Today, by analyzing this novel, I'd like to consider the role of and power of narrative about nature from the following two perspectives. One is the use of rhetorical devices, as Miyata-san, and the other is the role of narrative within this novel. So the reason why I focus on the rhetorical devices or tropes is simple. They are a means of verbalizing our thoughts and images and can play an important role in environmental literature in depicting nature and human relationship. And this also applies to everyday language, of course, but let's focus on literature for now. As Hubble and Brian point out, paying attention to the use of tropes is useful for thinking about human-nature relationship and view of nature from literary works. In this presentation, I will mainly focus on the repetition of stories that use metaphor and simile, and show what kind of interpretation can be derived by focusing on repeated expressions. And in addition to that, I would also like to consider Ishimure's view of narrative. As James and Moore argue, narrative is a touchstone in thinking about environmental issues in the field of environmental humanities. As shown later, Lake of Heaven contains not only stories about a village and its nature, but also scenes written about the role of the narrative. And those scenes gives useful suggestions for us to think about the essence of narrative and how narrative influence the real world. And so today I'll focus on the episodes about an important tree, Weeping Cherry of Okinomiya, to see how the rhetorical devices are used for describing human-nature relationship And to consider the role of narrative, we will see the scene where the narrative changes Masahiko drastically. So now let's start with the format. In chapter 1, Ohina explains to Masahiko what was a village like and how these villagers related to nature and so forth. And I quoted here is part of her explanation. She says, in the spring, it was a weeping cherry of Okinomiya. In autumn, it was a great ginkgo of Kodenbara. These were the trees of the gods, and the trees that were the markers of Amazoko village. And another place, Narera writes, that old weeping cherry had become rooted in the souls of all the people of the village. So now you may understand the importance of this tree for the villagers. But I want you to remember, Amazoko village is now underwater. About 35 years ago, a tree loved by people was cut down for building a sluiceway for the dam. And what's interesting is, the episode of when the tree was cut down appears over and over again. As highlighted in red, the tree being cut down is depicted by using the metaphor of bleeding. Ohina says to Masahiko, when it was cut down, blood gushed from its wounds. We all saw it. That tree sacrificed its life for us. And the same image is shared by other villagers as well. A man says, when it was cut down, the broken tree and all the remains were like blood. But he uses simile instead of metaphor, but a man's word and Ohina's are very similar. And there are another scenes that same simile is used. For example, the sawdust looked like the hemorrhaging of blood. And this is part of Kappei's recollection of when the tree was cut. As you can see from the words highlighted in red, Kappei and other villagers saw the sawdust as fresh blood. And another point I'd like to draw attention to is the words highlighted in blue, which is Kappei's grandmother's utterance. You were sacrificed for our lives. So this is very similar to what Ohina said. I quoted in the slide a little earlier. So by comparing these words, we can see that Ohina repeats almost the same words as Kappei's grandmother said 35 years ago. And now that it has become clear that similar episodes are repeated, so let's consider the following questions. Why is a similar episode repeated in this novel? Why do multiple characters tell the same story? Why not just once? Why not just one person telling the story? It can be pointed out that repetition of the similar episodes vividly shows that similar memories or narratives are shared within a community. By writing multiple stories told by multiple people, like a documentary film or a nonfiction essay that collect testimonies from various people, it is clearly depicted that memories and or narratives are shared among the villagers. And the repetition of the similar episodes makes the reader imagine that the villagers have probably been ruminating on the stories and memories for a long time. And through this, we can understand how the villagers value the weeping cherry and its memories, even though it's been over 3 decades since they lost the marker of their hometown. Now I'd like to move on to the second topic, the role of narrative in this novel. As Toyosato points out, villagers' words and behavior change Masahiko. A young man visits a dam for the first time, following his late grandfather's will. And this is clearly expressed in the following passage. And this passage is taken from the end of the story, and it shows that the narrative has at least two roles in this novel. After spending several days on the shores of the dam lake and interacting with nature and the villagers, Masahiko feels a new story forming within him and realizes that the way he sees the world has changed. As you can see from the first paragraph, the various stories about the villagers, which may include the episode about Weeping Cherry as we have seen here, remind Masahiko of grandfather's stories, and as a result, a new story is created in himself. In other words, Masahiko's new story or unknown world is created not only from interaction with nature around the dam lake, but also from other people's narrative. The second role of narrative in this novel is to change or renew the human-nature relationship. At the beginning of the second paragraph, the ability to receive signs from nature grows within Masahiko. And at the end of the same paragraph, his perception and thoughts about nature completely changed. Masahiko thinks, even a lump of dirt, you can look at it as something tribal. There isn't a single element that's not essential to the Earth's makeup. So what cannot be overlooked is that this occurred immediately after a new story was born inside him. So the emergence of new narrative and change in his interaction with the world are depicted as closely related. So this passage is, in short, a narrative that tells us what a narrative is. So from this series of events, we can get a glimpse of how Ishimure thought about narrative. So now let me wrap up my presentation. An analysis of the episodes about the Weeping Cherry revealed two things. First, the simile and metaphor were used to express how deeply the villagers felt love, intimacy, and the pain of losing the tree. And the second, the use of repetition succeeds in depicting the sharing of memories and stories related to the tree among the villagers. From this, we can see the importance of the tropes in both expressing and interpreting the relationship between humans and nature in literary works. And an analysis of a scene depicting Masahiko's change shows that listening to the stories about nature may be a trigger for changing people's awareness or experiences and view of world and nature. Indeed, it can be said that fiction is nothing more than fiction after all. However, there are worlds that can only be depicted through fiction, and worlds that can be expressed only through literature. So it is up to us, or readers, to decide whether to connect or separate them from the real world we live in. So these are the references. Thank you for listening.